Okay, our next speaker. We are really honored to have Javier Armas join us. He is a local guy, born and raised in Oakland, California. He is the founder of Budtender Education and also the founder of the Bay Area Latino Latina Cannabis Association, known as BALCA, B-A-L-C-A. Prior to the work that he's currently doing, he was a high school teacher as well as a paralegal. In addition to that, he has written an amazing book titled The Budtender Education Book, which has sold thousands to date. And he is at the front end of training all of our budtenders of the future. We're incredibly fortunate. He has brought his books here, and each one of you will end up with I believe a signed copy, right? So we are thrilled to have him talk about what he knows best. Javier.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here. Thank you for inviting me. As mentioned, I'm Javier Armas, born and raised here in Oakland. I'm official Oakland Equity. I recently just joined the Cannabis Regulatory Committee representing District 1. I had my first meeting last night. I'm pushing the lowering of taxes, helping an ecology of businesses to support cannabis businesses and creating a safer environment due to some of the problems out here in Oakland. But yeah, my main passion is Budtender Education. I've been working in cannabis retail sales for many years. I was a budtender in 04 to 07. That dispensary got shut down by the DEA in 09, and I returned back to cannabis when Prop 64 passed. And when I was working at all these retailers, the education of cannabis, as someone, I'm sorry, let me back up. I was a high school teacher for 5 years, and I got my social studies degree. So when you get your teaching degree, it takes about a year plus of credentialing, et cetera, you learn the science of pedagogy. And so when I returned back to cannabis retail, I could really see, as someone that has 5 years of public education, the level of standardized education within cannabis was like close to nothing. What was considered education in retail was branding. They're like, we're gonna give you a great education. And you go to a branding session and it's very much the history of this one brand. And so it doesn't have any of the standardization that classical education has, and it really doesn't give justice the history or science of cannabis. So as a result, and very similar to what Dr. Knox presented, I started a journey of trying to work on cannabis education. So up here I have 5 years experience. I've done about 56 presentations at retailers in Northern California. I have about 350 budtenders who follow my work, sold over 1,100 copies of my book. This is Blunts and More here, the first equity dispensary, and some of the budtenders on the left. And you could ask, why are budtenders so important? Well, budtenders are the key link between brands and patients. So the investors invest in brands, the brands go to retail, retail deals with the patients. And there's a huge gap between what the patient needs and what the brand is going after. And so we're gonna go a little bit into that. Within this exchange between patient and budtender, the budtender receives zero training from the institution on what needs to be known as far as medicine, pharmacology, law, biology, chemistry. Right? These are mega disciplines of knowledge in order to know cannabis law. If you look at Omar Figueroa's book, who writes a textbook on cannabis law every year, he said this arena of law is so complicated because they didn't erase the previous structures, they simply added to it, creating a really complex maze that changes every year. Same with science, as Dr. Knox presented, the pharmacology, the cannabinoids, the terpenes, and all their applications enters a very complex zone of chemistry and biology. So what are we gonna do about this difficult situation? What I've been doing in the last 5 years is getting the classic texts of both science and history. A lot of these works have been published in the last 10 years, the last 15 years. They're very new, they're very fresh. I'm not a scientist, right? So I can't really make a scientific argument about synthesizing this work. I'm a historian. So what I have been doing with Budtenders is summarizing each of these works based off publication date. So that way they have an understanding of when these texts were produced within that historical context, because if you're in cannabis, you know in 2012 or 2018, it's worlds of difference. On the right side, we have some of the key history books, Cannabis in Ancient Greece and the Roman World, Martin Booth's book, Cannabis, Chris Duval's The African Influences of Marijuana is a really key work. He also has another book on the botanical history of cannabis. He's at the University of Austin. So there's some really incredible texts, and I summarize these texts so Budtenders have access to them, because these books are 200 to 300 really thick pages, something that you get in undergrad, graduate school. Now there's a little funny design right here that I'm pointing to, and those represent clinical studies. So as Dr. Knox mentioned, there's a wealth of fascinating and really incredible clinical studies on cannabis that hasn't really hit literature. It hasn't really been written about in any way that enters our educational systems. So what I've been trying to do is take this big body of text and put it into a class series, The History of Cannabis Science. So I have 18 classes, which starts off with the archaeology and the endocannabinoid system as a premise, and then the ancient history of cannabis, China, India, the Neolithic Revolution. The Bible has fascinating aspects of cannabis influence as the Jews were enslaved in ancient Persia that was next to ancient India. So there's some really rich materials. Carbon testing is now at a very advanced level. We found THC pollen in the temples of Israel dating back 2500 BC, way before the Bible was written. So there's some really interesting historical materials. Class 9 and 10 is going to be my next book, The History of Mexico. The origins of prohibition in the Americas was Summus Diserrantis of 1484. The Catholic Church said anything that was psychoactive is against the church, and they were the first to pick up on the psychoactive properties of cannabis and were killing Mesoamerican herbal practitioners very early on, which influenced Mexican prohibition in 1920, which influenced US prohibition in 1937. Classes 14 to 17, as you could see, are in yellow. So as Dr. Knox mentioned, Dr. Mouchelin, I know I mispronounced his name, but the guy from Israel who's very famous and important, discovered the endocannabinoid system 1988 to 1992 period. So what happened with cannabis science is there's a before and after. Everything that's been developed after this point is really advanced and succinct on our biological system, looking at what ties to our receptors, CB1, CB2, the stuff that Dr. Knox was presenting on. What I am doing to teach this to non-scientists, as a non-scientist, is present on these clinical studies based off publication date, 92 to 01, 02 to 2012, 2012 to 2018, 2018 to 2022. The student must write a paper that incorporates aspects of both the history and the science of cannabis to create a framework that's a balance between these two disciplines to be able to see some of the dynamic scientific motion. Okay, so a lot of this stuff gets very complex. I worked in the Oakland high schools for 5 years. Part of the work, and you guys are in junior colleges, so part of the work of an educator is to be able to take really advanced concepts and break them down in ways that are accessible and go through an objective, accessible learning process. Like in pedagogy, they say you have to teach something 5 times before your student understands it, and ideally you have those 5 forms of explanation in different forms, so it's a multi-dimensional explanation. In the very first class, Cannabis Archaeology and the Endocannabinoid System, This map to the right is a really interesting study. 5 minutes? Okay. Really interesting study on the evolutionary biological system between multi-species and the relationship with cannabinoids, their version of an endocannabinoid system, which they don't call it that, and dogs, cats, all the way down to ancient hydra. So this stuff is really, really interesting. This is how I started off. Class 2, we go into the Neolithic Revolution, which is when humans first started using agriculture. There's some incredible research that when humans first started domesticating horses, we also domesticated hemp to domesticate those horses, which was as early as 10,000 BC. And now with THC pollen, we're able to look at ancient areas of both cannabis and hemp production. Right here, class 2, that's ancient Chinese cannabis cultivation. Speaking to the historical development of science, if you look to the right, cannabis and cannabinoids. In 2002, there were 66 cannabinoids known. A few years later, there were 70. 2 years ago, there was 112, and Dr. Knox mentioned 140 and counting. So this is one of the points that I really try to get to my students, is the evolutionary of scientific knowledge of cannabis. Now, there's a really cool quote here, page 55. The cannabinoid signaling system is teleologically millions of years old. It has been observed in mammals, fishes, and invertebrates down to very primitive organisms such as the hydra. And that's a German scientist who has this cool textbook. It's dated '02, but those are the things that we summarize. Dr. Ethan Rousseau is one of the leading pharmacologists here in the US who studies cannabis. He has some great work, great text that I highly recommend. Here's a really good quote to finish off. Cannabis is the single most versatile herbal remedy and most useful plant on earth. No other single plant contains as a wide range of medically active herbal constituents. So as you could see, the key learning objective, understanding the historical evolution of cannabis science. That is my key objective for Budtender Education. This was my very first class at Stizzy 180 O'Farrell, owned by Cindy de la Vega, first Latina equity dispensary owner, leader of BALCA. Some really brilliant budtenders who have been reading these advanced works, so it's been a great process to work with them. It's the first class that's graduating. I'm also working on other books, so we have Mexico and Cannabis, the history, 1530 to 1772, because it's the origins of prohibition in the Americas, as I mentioned. Books that captures cannabis pharmacology in a summarized format. Dr. Knox did a much better job, I just have to admit, but that's same objectives. And then an accessible platform to execute the class. And that is it. Thank you so much for listening to Budtender Education. That is my work here in the Bay Area. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Javier. Thank you. That's excellent. Don't go far, because we are going to hang out together up here. While we do that, can you all do one more stretch break? Feel free to stand up, stretch, and whenever you want to sit down, you can sit down. But we just want to make sure to keep those bodies moving as we are going to ask Javier some questions. So I guess before we get started, we have a couple minutes. Are there any questions about Budtender Education and the work that Javier has been doing in that area? Any questions from the audience? Yes, awesome.
So I am a Budtender and brand ambassador myself.
Okay.
I have experience in the industry for the past year. My question is, with the final, what do you plan to do with that after the students have completed that? Is that what you want to end up publishing, like in like a collaboration format, or like? I'm just very curious as to the final, because it does remind me of like my college courses, in the sense that we have an 18-week course. Each week we have a different topic. We focus on that. We take our tests, and at the end we just get the overall cumulative topics. So what is the final going to be used with?
So that's a great question. So in this day and age, it's never been easier to self-publish, technologically, economically, and logistically. So I'm offering to all the budtenders that we're gonna publish their final. We gotta go through some edits. We're not gonna publish their first draft. So I wanna go through some edits, but I want to create a page, Budtender Knowledge or something like that, where we're gonna publish the finals, and everything that I have is in Spanish. So I'm telling them we should translate everything in Spanish, multilingual.
Absolutely.
So yes, there is a plan to publish all of them. It's not mandatory, because some of them are going to feel insecure about it, which is understandable. But most of the budtenders I deal with are Black, Latina, Asian, mostly people of color, and to be encouraged to publish, I think, is a very empowering practice, and so that's part of the work I do with BALCA, very Latino, and so BALCA and Budtender Education is kind of this synergistic movement.
We're gonna get there. We're gonna get to BALCA.
So yeah.
One more question from the audience. Any other questions for Javier when it comes to Budtender Education? Okay. Yes, there is a question. All right.
As far as the Budtender education, so do you ever see this being something that could be part of like the iTrain system, right? The ETPL? Is this something that would be able to be on the ETPL list so that job seekers could obtain the training and then get a certificate and then get supported through their cities or respective government funds?
Absolutely, but you don't see the pragmatic stuff like how to use a cashier or scanning. It's the class is the class. So it's a question is that something that workplace needs, right? And so a lot of the Budtenders who I'd say go above and beyond their exact tasks are really into this. And so it's not for everyone. There is an intellectual element to it. There's reading, there's writing, but yeah, if the institution wants it, that'd be great. I haven't seen it right now, you know. So but this is obviously something to work towards.
Okay, and we have some time for more questions for Javier, but I want to tell a little story. We met probably, I don't know, 18 months ago, maybe longer than that. And he came to me saying, hey, I'm passionate about Budtender education. I have this book. How do I partner with the community colleges to get the knowledge that I have? And clearly this guy has done his research. He has a teaching background. How do I get that information into the classroom? So my request from all of you as educators is you have a resource right here. He's eager. He wants to come and speak in your classes. He would love to teach this topic as we develop curriculum. So make sure you reach out to him in that regard because he definitely knows what he's talking about. He has the teaching background, and I think he has a wonderful story and research to share with all of our students. All right, so we're going to transition into BALCA and talk a little bit about that. And before we do that, I just want to acknowledge that this was supposed to be an industry association panel. Because of the times we're in, 2 of our individuals dropped out because they just weren't feeling well. So we respect their decision to not spread whatever they have. But since we have Javier here, I wanted to just give you a moment to share more about BALCA and maybe a little bit about how it aligns with Budtender Education, but share a little bit about that story and what BALCA is all about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the cannabis industry and you look at who works it and Budtenders, obviously there's a lot of people of color, and obviously there's a lot of Latinos and Latinas. In California, it's like 30% white, 36% Latino. It's like a big demographic difference. But if you don't really see it translate into economic power, ownership, it's a very small percentage of Latino cannabis business owners. The ones that are very small businesses, it doesn't have major market acquisition or major investment. So you really see the imparity of power. Now, this really gets tricky when you look at the history because the Mexican Revolution brought a lot of Mexicanos over here with a lot of knowledge of marijuana. And that was what was criminalized. So you really have a very problematic history in California where you have the demonization of one group and unearthing the business right in that exact same landscape. And this is not just the plant itself, the knowledge, the name, and so on. I mean, we're literally told, don't use the word marijuana, it's racist. Like, why is it racist? Oh, because Anslinger said Mexicans were criminals in 1937. This has nothing to do with the origins of the word, which is rooted in 1840s and earlier against Spanish Inquisition, the yerboleras who had knowledge of herbs. And so within this landscape, a lot of Latinos were like, we have to get a voice, we gotta build an organization, we gotta build a community, and out of that, BALCA built 5 principles. Education, civil rights, business ownership, culture, and community. And it launched the first bilingual cannabis newsletter, published 59 articles, 6 newsletters, a book is coming out, 4 major community fundraiser events, San Jose, Oakland, San Francisco, and it's not led by people outside the industry. It's led by real equity cannabis operators. And it's the first of its kind, it's grassroots. And we help small businesses get on the map, promotion, connections with retail. If they need X, we might know X. We connect person with X. So for example, Latina, Sonoma County agricultural farmer hit me up yesterday, and I connected her with, his name's Javier as well, in LA. It was LA Equity has all his licenses. So there's a NorCal farm connecting to an LA dispensary owner. So this is some of the work BALCA does: networking, business development, literature production, educational production. And then our Latin America department is really exciting. We had a mixer with the guy from Argentina who studied at Oaksterdam, a guy from Colombia, and then one of our members went to Canigma in Mexico City, so we're gonna start interviewing Mexico City. That's gonna be huge when Mexico goes legal. It's our neighbors. They have a longer history with marijuana cannabis than the US does, and our histories are really intertwined. I mean, the border between US and Mexico is very much a border. It's very much a history of marijuana. I mean, that was an epicenter. The soldiers, the troops, the police. It's a really dynamic story that goes back to the Mexican Revolution and before. So anyways, these were some of the reasons why we wanted to build BALCA. It's been a very dynamic experience, and as you could tell, I'm into this. Yes.
You are absolutely into it, and I love it. All right, so next question, knowing that you're in a room full of educators and a couple of students here, what are some challenges within your industry? And we can, I mean, it's an association representing Blacks and Latinos, so take this within context. What are some challenges within your industry within regards to developing a well-trained workforce? What are some things that you've seen when it comes to well-trained workforce for?
I mean, it's kind of sad. I don't totally see it. Like, you really have to train yourself. I don't see institutions successfully training the workforce. You have to be driven by your own passion, buying books on Amazon, going out of your way. Like, you know, a lot of you probably are here based off your individual initiative and not institutional initiative. You know, there might be institutional pluses, but I doubt that was the real driver. It's the same with Budtenders, the same in the industry. You really have to have a passion to go over these very difficult experiences. I mean, if you're in Oakland, you have one of the most difficult experiences. I mean, there's robberies, there's threats. All my friends, not all, most of my friends have been robbed. I've been received threats. It's not the easiest place to operate. San Francisco definitely has problems. Berkeley's a little nicer. You know, it's those nuances, but yet to build in the cannabis industry, you have to be very, very resilient, and it's been cutting down. There's been layoffs. You don't have all the jobs. I used to have a great salary job. I was laid off. Not anything I did wrong, but the price of flower dropped in the last 9 months. There's overproduction of flower, not enough retailers. 1/3 of California doesn't even have a retailer, so you have clogging problems. So instead of me trying to engage in sales, what I do is analyze this economically and then try to write about it, integrate into Budtender Education, because as you can see today, there's a deep lack of cannabis education. So I think that's where we can really build infrastructure that's not strangled by high taxes, regulations. There's nothing illegal about sending 100 books from Oakland to New York, unlike other substances. So it's a really nice terrain that's underdeveloped, that should be developed. And one thing I tell the cannabis industry, the book industry is very developed. And the book industry and the cannabis industry have very little relationship. Steve D'Angelo is supposed to come. Yeah. Cannabis Manifesto, major book. I highly recommend it. Everyone should read that. And you'd think that genre would be more developed. It's surprisingly very underdeveloped. So I really appreciate the work Dr. Knox does and people of that caliber, because they're literally leading intellectuals of this industry.
So you definitely hit on some of the challenges that you're facing and that you've seen within the industry. What are some opportunities for Blacks and Latinos in the industry as you see it? Where are some bright spots moving forward?
For sure, yeah, no, there's this great brand, Familia, there's, Seventh Wave, there's some great brands out there that have captured their own culture, their own history, their own uniqueness. They brand their own history as legacy, and they don't have a huge staff. They didn't take big investments, so they don't need to make mega sales to make profits. They capture their niche, and they make it work, but it's very, very niche. And I think Blacks and Latinos have a really powerful position to historicize, obviously my history, historicize their experience into a brand story that articulates a unique product that doesn't exist, and you can't expect to make $1 million on your first run, be realistic. You gotta have small production and with education that can be marketing, right? Because if you think about what is marketing, some people, I would say, is psychological manipulation, but that's one wing of the spectrum versus another wing where it's very educational and historic based.
I'm getting the hook here soon, so I want to make sure that there's an opportunity for questions from the audience. So if there are any questions after my next question that I ask, be ready to ask the question. So my next question is, what advice, so you're in a room full of educators, and we're the community college system in California, and we believe that we're an open access institution and that we serve the typical Californian, which has been shifting over time, right? And it's a diverse population that we serve. So we want to serve the needs of the industry, and that's why we're all here. We weren't sent here mandated to be here by our institutions. So what advice would you give to faculty who want to develop curriculum and train the workforce? Do you have any advice that you could give to them when it comes to meeting them where they are and meeting their needs?
Yeah, I mean, if you're aspired to do that, it's phenomenal. The curriculum doesn't exist, so we have to create it. I'm ready. And that's the exciting part. So we have a lot of clinical studies. We do not have developed curriculum for community colleges, high school level. It just doesn't exist, right? I've read all the histories. The historians debate each other about X, Y, and Z. The science is developing very dynamically, as you can see with Dr. Knox. But yeah, as far as being able to execute class X, Y, and Z, it doesn't exist. I think in the next 24 months, that's really our task, turning these clinical studies, turning these 300-400 history page books into accessible classes that the 18-year-old who from high school can come in. I taught high school for 5 years, and a lot of my Budtenders were in their 20s, were my high school students, same group. I was like, oh my God, so learning that process of young people and engaging them, I think that's what we have to do. But yeah, there's no key right now. I'm sorry, it just doesn't exist. I order every book on cannabis in English or Spanish, and the curriculum, I can guarantee you, at this day and age, does not exist. So, really, the dynamic discussion is creating it as a community.
Well, I'm excited to inform you, Javier, and the rest of the folks in the audience. We actually do have some community colleges that are stepping up and building the curriculum. We have City College San Francisco, first associate's degree in cannabis studies. Diablo Valley College is in the house. They have some programs that they've developed in horticulture and entrepreneurship. So we are trying to meet the needs. So we hear you loud and clear. We're gonna keep going. I have a question way back here from one of our participants. I saw a hand. Yes.
Hi, Javier. So I just wanted to, basically I represent MLVS, Mission Language Vocational School. And right now we're running a culinary cannabis infusion program. So we're teaching the basics of it, but we do include history. We do include policy because you need to know all of that to be able to work with cannabis. So we are in the middle of developing curriculum. Thank you for doing some of the legwork on that history because honestly, we don't have access to that information, and our program is for free. So it's access to most of the brown and black communities in the city, and the Bay Area. So anyways, I just wanted to let you guys know that there is programs geared to be free, right, and accessible for folks who have been hit hard by the drugs on war. Thank you. For war on drugs.
Absolutely, it's a great opportunity to partner with BALCA. Thank you. Any other questions? Time for one or two questions. One or two additional questions for Javier. Yes, I see a question in the back.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. So interesting, fascinating. I just wanted to ask more about just workforce opportunities and opportunities that you see in the industry. You've talked a lot about just business and sales and the retail part of it, and I heard you mention the growing aspect too, and I wondered if you know anything related to hemp and just the growing and kind of industrial uses of hemp and any opportunities you're aware of in the state, and just if you have any thoughts or knowledge about that.
Hemp is so big, We have a friend in BALCA named Lisa Sundberg, who's an indigenous leader in Humboldt County, and she acquired a huge grant from studying the French hemp houses that have a 300-year history, and her whole life goal, as of recent, people change, is to go around all the indigenous reservations in the U.S. and build hempcrete, which is safer for you biologically, because if you think about at your house, your foundation is made of concrete. If there's an airway to you, you are breathing concrete, and that could be toxic. So hempcrete is healthier than concrete. And I Googled concrete Oakland businesses one time, and 30 businesses shot up. And a lot of those are Latino, a lot of those are people of color, so there's definitely an important move of working on hempcrete against concrete. Now the price of wood is higher than ever. We can make a really amazing hemp fake redwood, right? They like press it and all this stuff. It's more expensive, but with technology, we can get that price down. And then paper as well. Paper is way more expensive than hemp paper is way more expensive than regular paper. With technology and agricultural projects, we can get those prices down. So the potential that exists in hemp is probably 150 more than plant-touching cannabis, because plant-touching cannabis is highly regulated, highly taxed.
Great, thank you.
I wanted to ask a question in regards to you're publishing this material in English and in Spanish.
Yup.
Have you noticed? Thank you for doing that, by the way.
Absolutely.
Have you noticed a bridging of the gap between the jobs that are out there for our Hispanic community?
What do you mean? There's a lot of Hispanic
Meaning, like,
workers out there.
are Spanish speakers getting jobs in the industry because of the materials, or have we gotten there yet?
Well, yeah, but it's like budtenders, agricultural workers, truck drivers, and the MSO, the higher level, it's very limited. And then as far as ownership, the actual statistics 5.6, that's from old data. And like, if I publish a book and form an LLC based off that book and I register that LLC, I'm a business owner, even if I made $50 in sales. So you also have to contextualize who owns Harborside, who owns some of these really big institutions. There's major corporate investments that are going on in some of these major retailers and brands that are above $100 million. So it's easy to create a statistical system to make it look like there's progress. But no, I think Latinos are way proletarianized within the cannabis industry, and there's very little of the leadership and ownership, and that's, so that's some of the work that we do. But at the same time, it's like, last night I was at the Cannabis Regulatory Committee, and there's all these complaints about a lack of money in Oakland. It's like, nothing new, right? And I'm like, if we're gonna build something, we can't simply just attack and assume that there's enough and that needs to be distributed. We need to generate, we need to build something. So it's not simply to attack me like, we need more integration. There also needs to be a value addition system, and that's how you can get into higher levels of jobs. And so I think that's something that we have to create for Latinos, Blacks, Asians, people of, the whole community. So there's vertical integration, and you're not stuck at the bottom as a permanent day laborer. And so that does exist by its own natural rhythms, and we can challenge that. We just have to challenge that. It doesn't go automatically.
All right, can we give a big round of applause for Javier Armas?
Thank you guys. You guys are the best. Thank you. So cool.
Excellent presentation.